Well, welcome all to the 6th webinar in our AgForce Winter series on sustainability in agriculture. I'm Annie Rutledge, a Senior Policy Advisor at AgForce, and I'll be your facilitator tonight. Sustainability is at the core of our agricultural producers' success, often achieved under challenging circumstances. Our producers here in Australia and in Queensland lead the way in adopting new and improved practices, and this adaptability ensures that our sector continues to thrive. For those of you who are guests of AgForce tonight, allow me to briefly introduce our organisation. AgForce is a peak organisation representing Queensland's cane, cattle, grain and sheep, wool and goat producers. AgForce provides advocacy to its advanced sustainable agribusiness. We have over 6,500 farmers, individuals and businesses who provide support to AgForce through membership. We thank those members present tonight for their ongoing support for our mission. Sustainability is among the key policy areas for advocacy at AgForce. We have a sustainability committee of which I'm the secretariat. Our committee has identified that there is a key need for continued education, which is why we've convened this webinar series to hear from experts on various topics related to sustainable agriculture. Please note that the information shared in these webinars is general and not a substitute for professional advice. For tonight's webinar, we'll hold all questions until the end. You're welcome to submit your questions in the chat and I'll read them out during question time. So tonight we'll warmly welcome our lineup of guest speakers from the Meat and Livestock Australia MLA Sustainability team. I'll hand over now to the first of our MLA speakers. Before we launch into your presentation, can you briefly introduce yourself and your role, and when you're finished, pass on to the next speaker.
Very good. Thanks very much, Annie. I'll just share my screen. Yeah, thanks very much. I'm Dr. Joe McMeniman and I'm Group Manager for Sustainability at MLA, and it's great to be here today just to introduce the Sustainability R&D program at MLA. Just briefly, I just wanted to introduce the Sustainability team to everyone. We have Julia Waite, who's the CN30 Project Manager, Harriet Baldwin, who's the Project Manager for Environmental Sustainability, Jenny Lim, who's the Project Manager for Environmental Markets and Sustainability, Courtney Nelson, who's the Manager for the Sheep Sustainability Framework, Jacob Betros, who's Manager for Beef Sustainability Frameworks, and also Hilary Connors, who works in the Sustainability Adoption team. So if any producers have any inquiries, we're here to help. So please reach out. Don't hesitate to reach out to us through the MLA website or give the MLA service line a call, and we're happy to speak to you about any of your interests in sustainability. I just wanted to kick off today saying, look, it's a really important era that we're going through in the globally. It looks like that globally the Paris Agreement, which set a target of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, we're not going to meet that. Unfortunately, it looks like that's going to be exceeded sometime in the next 4 years. And the graph below shows the temperature relative to 1850 to 1900 and just shows the acceleration of temperature increase. The graph to the right shows global atmospheric methane concentrations. Again, they're going up rapidly. The cattle and sheep obviously are a very small proportion of that increase. We only account for somewhere around 16% of the global methane budget. So we're not a massive contributor, but we are a contributor. So looking at all these things, it's really important because as we move to through this, it's a very interesting time. You know, in Australia currently we have the mandatory climate disclosures that have been passed through the Senate and come into full force on the 1st of January 2025, which will basically mandate that large companies, based on their gross revenue or employee numbers, will need to produce a sustainability report, report their Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions, outline a target. The target could be to do nothing, or it could be to decrease emissions, but they have to publicly disclose that and report on their progress towards that target on an annual basis. The other really interesting thing at the moment is the federal government is a signatory to the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and as part of that, they're holding a Global Nature Positive Summit in Sydney in later this year, and there's also been the passing of the Nature Repair Act in the federal legislation, which seeks to establish a voluntary market for nature repair, basically, so nature repair credits. And the federal government, I think this week started consultation around, method development side of things. So interesting thing about this framework is its commitment, not from the Australian government, but from the signatories as a whole, to stimulate $200 billion US a year in the nature repair market up to 2030. So there's going to be a lot of activity, I suggest, in the next 5 years around this space. The other interesting thing at the moment is obviously the acceleration around and media around deforestation. Obviously, there was a lot of media this week around Woolworths, talking about their deforestation-free target by the end of 2025. Obviously, there's conversations going around the EU deforestation regulation as well currently. So a lot of moving parts, and they all seem to sort of be accelerating this year. Just a bit for AgForce members about who MLA, who we serve, I guess, and I guess our primary function is as a R&D and marketing service provider to the red meat industry. And as part of that, doing that, we consult very regularly with Alpha, Cattle Australia, Geica and Sheep Producers Australia around both marketing and R&D priorities. And we don't get involved in policy or advocacy or strategy. We're very much our remit's centred on R&D and marketing. In terms of how we determine our priorities for what we do in our R&D programs, we have a consultation process that's set up, and we basically we just actually had this a couple of weeks ago. Our biannual gathering of all the regional research groups from all over Australia, but we work with NABRAC, Northern Australian Beef Research Council, WARAC, the Western Australian Livestock Research Council, and SALRAC, the Southern Australian Livestock Research Council, and their regions, to basically, through an annual process, to identify their annual R&D priorities through workshops in those regions, and then they bring that to a broader workshop with MLA, where we look at our existing investments, our strategy going forward, and we basically decide on priority areas that we will invest in for the following year. And so that process involves a panel called the Red Meat Panel, which involves the chair of each regional research council, plus a Cattle Australia representative, and a Sheep Producers Australia representative, and MLA. And so in terms of how your levy gets spent, that's the current process for how we determine these priorities. And central to that are the peak industry bodies and the regional research councils. Just wanted to quickly touch on MLA sustainability program. So currently our program is centred in a number of key areas. The first is around emissions avoidance, so looking at low emission genetics for methane, low emissions feed base, feed additives, sequestration, so what we can do in soil carbon in grazing systems, and also agroforestry. We've started to do R&D in some pilot systems around credential transfer systems. So how can we help transfer credentials through the supply chain, and also some work in natural capital assessment frameworks. We also have an existing investment in climate resilience. So we are currently funding the Northern Australian Climate Program, and that embeds 16 climate mates, they're called. They're extension officers based in Northern Regional Australia that are a service to help producers interpret Bureau of Meteorology, I guess, forecasting indices. So producers can have the best information available to help inform their own seasonal weather forecasting and decisions they need to make on farm. We also have a range of producer resources in terms of carbon edge training courses. I'll talk about that later on, carbon e-learning and carbon calculators. Moving forward, we're sort of at a unique time at MLA where we're really planning our next 5-year strategic plan. And I'm very keen. I've been in the role as group manager now for 2 months. I've spent the last 20 years of my career in the beef feedlot industry, but I've got a huge passion for sustainability, and I'm really keen to move our language to things that are meaningful for producers. So the areas that we're looking forward to going forward is consolidating our themes into efficient livestock, which is really around not leaving any money on the table. Global climate. So what can we do to do our bit? The whole world's going to decarbonise pretty rapidly, I'd say, in the next 10 years. So, what can we do our bit for that side? Healthy grazing lands. How can we help hand these assets to the next generation, which is important for many farming families. And the other really important bit I'm really excited about coming into the role is tracking progress. So we need to move into action phase in this area, and tracking return on investment for our R&D investments, and also our progress around net emissions. So our FY25 priorities, they're still under negotiation with the Red Meat Panel currently. As I mentioned, we just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago. So we're working on what we're going to do for this financial year. As I said, we're also planning our next year 5-year plan, and central to doing that is our consultation with Alpha, Geica, Cattle Australia and sheep producers. That's in our memorandum of understanding with the federal government. We have to honour that. But I want to give you some insight to some promising areas today around some of the cool things that have been happening in the program lately. One of the really interesting things at the moment is we've got a very large investment in genetics around opportunities to breed low emission animals. And so we've got quite a large northern beef project being led by University of Queensland, Ben Hayes, who's a world-renowned geneticist for cattle. We're basically looking at 4,500 cattle measured across. They've got a repronomics herd with multiple genotypes, Brahman and Drought Master bin herds, and 2 major northern pastoral companies to establish genomic breeding values for residual methane by 2027. So with methane, selecting for methane is not as simple as selecting for reduced methane production on a grams per day basis, because methane production is correlated to dry matter intake, very, very highly correlated to dry matter intake. So the really smart thing that these researchers have uncovered is they've developed a residual methane selection value, which takes out body weight and dry matter intake influences, so they can actually purely select for like lower emitting animals without affecting performance of the animals. And so that's underway. And there's also a sister project in Southern Beef targeting to release indexes around late 2026. So there's Angus sire herd and the southern multi-breed populations. 8,000 animals are being measured in that project. It's quite a large project, and the steers are going to be measured in the feedlot and the heifers on pasture. They're using different methods for the different sites, but green feed units are one of the measurements that they're using. This is the green feed unit below. Basically, they come in and eat a pellet in the unit to attract it to them, and while they're breathing and eating the pellet, their methane emissions get sucked into a measurement sensor, and that basically measures their emissions on pasture. The cattle are also important part of this is also measuring them in individual intake scenarios. So they've got grow safe units or the equivalent of grow safe units, so they can actually measure individual intake to remove that biasing factor out of it. Another cool thing we've been working on a lot is how do we get these inhibitors out into the grazing environment? We've done a lot of work in feedlots where we can see we can inhibit methane by 60 to 90% in a feedlot. But what is not clear still is the effects on productivity. So in a feedlot environment where we're seeing positive, neutral, sometimes negative results on performance in feedlots when we inhibit methane, and we're expanding our R&D to understand that this year. We think it may be related to hydrogen accumulation in the rumen in feedlot environments. In the grazing environment, surprisingly, we know very little, and we're investing heavily this year to expand our grazing R&D. And what we've seen in a trial last year was we actually saw positive productivity responses in the grazing environment to adding Bovair, which is a 3-NOP, which is an inhibitor for the last stage of methanogenesis. We saw a 6% increase in average daily gain and about a 16% decrease in methane in that scenario, which led to about a 25% improvement in emissions intensity on pasture. So that's quite exciting, and it's only one trial, and we have to expand it to more and more trials. But it'll be really interesting to see how consistent the productivity responses are in grazing environments, because in grazing environments, you have a different rumen microbiome to feedlot environments, and there's actually more acetogens which help utilise hydrogen. So we think we're really interested to see how this rolls out. We're looking at different ways of administering this in pasture-based environments, from slow-release polymers to boluses to water. We're really trying to upscale this year and get some really good replicated data. We have to also work on stability of these actives, because in a feedlot, we can make sure they're really stable because we can administer them every day. When we go into a grazing environment and we leave them out in the sun and open air for, weeks on end, we have to invest in the R&D to stabilise these compounds. So I think this is all a fruitful area for our research and really exciting. This was the first trial in the world to demonstrate this year, so we are trying to get to the answer to this as quickly as we can, but it's not an easy area to operate in because ruminants have been doing this for millions of years, producing methane, so trying to inhibit it is a whole nother ball game. Really other exciting things we're doing, we're working in carbon flux in legume systems. So we're partnered with Agrimix, which is basically a seed supplier for Desmanthus, and they're expanding into Leukina as well. But they're really interested in expanding their business model beyond just seed sales. So they're interested actually really around how do we actually accurately measure carbon accumulation in soil profiles across grazing properties. So they've actually pioneered, in collaboration with QUT's done all the research through Peter Grace and Dave Rollings at QUT. They've pioneered the use of these flux towers to measure CO2 flux in and out of the soil on pastoral properties. And one of these flux towers can measure pretty large areas. I think it's up to 50 hectares potentially of flux in and out of a system. That's the maximum reach. They don't want, ideally they're not that big areas, but they are more accurate at measuring changes in flux of carbon in and out of soils than, say, spot sampling throughout the ecosystem. To actually get accurate spot sampling, you've got to take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of samples to get accuracy. So we're going to release the final report findings for this in April 2025, but they've actually developed this measure, model, verify approach using these flux towers, where you can roll a flux tower into a landscape for a period of, months, basically, get accurate measures over that period, and then move it to another property or whatever, and then you come back and you remeasure in a few years. So they've pioneered trying to develop a lower cost way of benchmarking this, and also a better way to get emissions measurements in the systems. And what's really interesting is they're establishing what is realistic in terms of gains in different systems with this. And it's really, really exciting, because it seems that not in all environments are set up to accrue carbon, but there are sort of some environments that have got clay soils and rainfall above 550 mils, which does suit a lot of the Brigalow Belt and parts of Queensland, where there might be opportunities for soil carbon gains with the right legume in the system to stimulate nitrogen and pasture growth. So yeah, we're excited about this. We've got to get the report finalised and out to industry, but yeah, really interesting stuff. And if we can get those gains, it might provide some opportunities for offsetting emissions. We've done a lot of work with Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries around agroforestry, and this is a project called Stake and Wood, which is basically projecting net present value returns to, I guess, silvopastoral systems. And the preliminary models suggest that native thin silvopastoral or improved thin silvopastoral systems generate higher net present values than open pasture systems, but it can take a fair while to be basically to accrue those. So yeah, it's a long-term play with agroforestry. It's not a short-term gain, but yeah, it is interesting, and that project's ongoing. And when we come out of it, we're going to have some very clear extension deliverables we can get out to Queensland producers around that project. Just wanted to lastly mention Carbon Edge. So Carbon Edge is basically an introductory training course for producers to help improve your understanding of carbon, the whole carbon systems and emissions and all those sort of things. So we've got a range of courses currently. You just search MLA website for Carbon Edge. Moving forward, we are also looking at how we can get these sponsored by different entities to lower the cost to producers, to get more producers to attend these workshops. So MLA is committed to continuing to roll out Carbon Edge, and we're going to continue to look for ways to lower the cost of attending these workshops. Initially, the cost to attend these is about $1,000 a registrant, and we recognise that it is a significant cost to producers to that area. But stand by. We are looking at how we can progress to sponsorship options for future carbon workshops in the future to lower the cost to the registrants, because I think this area of carbon literacy is an area that's not going to isn't going to go away. We're going to have to continue to look at this and how we can help support producers in improving their understanding in the space. With that, Annie, I'll pass over to Jacob Betros, and I'll wait for the end for any questions. Over to you, Jacob.
Thanks, Joe, and I'll quickly share my slide as well. So hopefully you can all see that now. Thumbs up, thanks, Annie. So for those who haven't met me before, my name is Jacob Betros. I'm the Manager of Beef Sustainability with Meat and Livestock Australia, and my main role within that role is to oversee the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework, which is an industry-led initiative to disclose the sustainability performance of the industry across a number of priorities and themes. And we've been doing that since 2017, and we report to an independent sustainability steering group, which is currently under the Red Meat Advisory Council. Because the framework's been around for so many years now, I am going to skip through a lot of the background. However, I did want to remind everyone how we come about what we report on, and that's through something that we call a materiality assessment. This one was done in 2020, and we are currently just beginning to undertake the latest update of our materiality assessment. hoping to be completed early next year. What the materiality does is it shows us the priorities which both have an impact on the industry and which the industry has an impact on. What you can see in this graph in front of you is along the x-axis is the area that the industry has the most control over. So as you can see, 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all animal welfare topics. That's because of the close interactions that the industry have with those animals. Along the y-axis is the level of influence those priorities have over external stakeholders when they make a decision about the industry. So you can see again, those animal welfare priorities are very important to them, as well as a lot of those environmental ones, such as trees, forests and woodlands, and greenhouse gas emissions and ground cover. Earlier this year at Beef Australia in Rockhampton, we released our 2024 annual report showcasing a number of improvements within the industry. We had a seminar where we heard from a supply chain panel highlighting the importance of sustainability disclosures to their operations, both internal to the industry and external. So we had NAB, National Australia Bank, McDonald's, Tees Australia and Hewitt Foods all attending that panel. And we were very fortunate to be joined at the time by the then Minister for Agriculture, Murray Watt, who spoke about how the framework is actually being used internationally and through market and to help enable market access as well. Excitingly, this year we've also launched a new digital dashboard, which is public and on the website. So anyone can go in and they can see the trends and how we've been performing over the last 6 to 7 years for where we have that data as well. What I want to do now is just quickly run through some of the highlights that the industry has achieved and which has been captured in this year's annual update and that we're focusing on our communications with to our entire supply chain. Most people would have heard by now the ambitions that we have around reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and Joe spoke a lot about that in his presentations. The latest data shows that in 2021, the beef industry had reduced its net CO2 equivalent emissions from the 2005 baseline by 78.2%. It is important to note the year of measurement, that being 2021. It was a significantly good year weather-wise, and vegetation and grass growth accounted for a large amount of carbon sequestration. Next was our animal welfare. So the Australian beef industry has a bold commitment, which is aspiring to 100% use of effective and appropriate pain mitigation for invasive procedures by 2030. Based on our producers survey commissioned by Meat and Livestock Australia in 2024, we found that when undertaking husbandry procedures, so dehorning, disbudding, castration and spaying, 31% of respondents stated that they used pain management. Further analysis of those 31 producers showed that it reflected custodianship of 40% of the national herd. So we can see that some of these producers, I guess, are representative of owning larger amounts of the herd, managing larger amounts. Our feedlot sector also has made a commitment to ensure that all cattle within its care has access to shade by 2026. And in 2023, 68% of all feedlot capacity had access to shade. This was an increase of 5% from 2022. For live export, the total mortality rate of cattle exported on sea voyages in 2023 was just 0.05%. The rate is testament not to just industry regulation, but implementation of processes by the industry every day in its operations. The live export industry provides an enormous service to global food security and animal welfare. Live export with cattle and sheep provide $1.2 billion in value to Australia and further benefits our regional and rural communities, and food security not only that adds on to the food security to our international rural communities as well. Biodiversity is a benefit of our extensive supply chain, but it remains a difficult area to monitor and determine progress. So until we can fully measure and determine the value of biodiversity, we are measuring the amount of productive land which is managed directly for biodiversity outcomes. So in 2023, 55% of grazing land was managed actively through practices such as weed management, pest management, prescribed burning, revegetation, soil remedy works, and fencing riparian areas. That's up from 44% last year. That equates to about 160 million hectares, and that actually reflects a size that is larger than the European farms all combined as well. So that's a pretty fantastic outcome for Australian biodiversity. Vegetation management and deforestation continue to be a major focus point for the Sustainability Steering Group under the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework. And we recognise that if we don't act to demonstrate the credentials in this area, some external initiatives are coming into us, such as the Science Based Targets Initiative and the EU Deforestation Regulation. But vegetation management has been commendable in recent years. And as we can see here, that we saw an area of forest in Northern Australian grazing properties, so Queensland, Northern Territory and WA, in 2021, reached its highest level since monitoring began 30 years ago in 1991, so accounting for almost 55 million hectares of forest. Ground cover management is also critical to drought resilience and soil health. And unfortunately, this was one of our negative trends this year, as we had some declines in ground cover to September 2023. So this measurement was in 2023, that 57.4% of NRM regions in Australia had achieved healthy ground cover thresholds. And those healthy ground cover thresholds are determined based on where that region is. So for the wet tropics and coastal regions, you're generally seeing 80% requirement, whereas in the rangelands, 50% is considered healthy ground cover. Within the economics, our market access is improving with a total reduction of non-tariff trade barriers, such as the use of import restrictions or labelling, being reduced by 474 million since 2020. In this period, 91% of Australian beef exports are now covered by one or more preferential trade agreements. They are our highlights that we've released, and I do encourage everyone to go online and read the full report to see all the performance. We have 54 indicators, so I didn't want to burden you with all the data today. But I do just want to quickly highlight the importance of engagement in what we do as well. These three slides highlight who we do engage with, and as you can see here, our industry bodies are critical to the success of the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework, and it allows us to ensure we have industry ownership and consistent messaging across the board as well. Agricultural corporations are key when communicating with supply chains and our external stakeholders, and they have access to a lot of market conversations and negotiations, as do our wholesalers and distributors, who often know exactly what customers are expecting and chasing, and are beginning to demand and influence their buying decisions as well. We work closely with these retailers and financiers to ensure they are aware of everything that the industry is achieving. One of our most recent engagements is with HelloFresh, who are wanting to partner with the industry on some sustainability initiatives, which will potentially increase the beef offering on their menu. I've made mention of the importance of having our finance stakeholders closely involved, and so did Joe through some of those disclosure requirements. And while some of these conversations can be a bit interesting and see views coming from a different angle, by being at the roundtable together, we have the best opportunity to influence some of those outcomes. Lastly, research is key for sustainability, and keeping every one of these people involved in our progress of the framework showcases to our stakeholders our commitment to continual improvement. And the same goes for our government departments. And lastly, when necessary, we involve the media to further convey our message. We need everyone on deck to be supporting and following through on our messages. I will wrap it up there as a very brief overview of our progress within the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework, and pass over to Courtney Nelson.
Thanks, Jacob, and hi everyone. My name is Courtney Nelson, and I manage the Sheep Sustainability Framework at Meat and Livestock Australia. I've been in the role now for 15 months, so I have 1 year of reporting under my belt and heading into a second. And I have the joy of giving you an update from the Sheep Sustainability Framework's 2024 annual report. So just by way of background, the Sheep Sustainability Framework is recognised as being a dual commodity framework. So we report equally on the production of sheep meat and wool, and it's jointly owned by Sheep Producers Australia and Wool Producers Australia. Next slide, please, Jacob. So the Sheep Sustainability Framework was established in 2021, and its first job essentially was to define what sustainability means in a sheep industry context and how we can all work towards the same vision. And so this is the definition that it came up with. And ultimately from that, it brought about our 4 key themes of reporting. So those being caring for our sheep, enhancing the environment, looking after our people, customers and community, and ensuring our financial resilience. Next slide, please. Now, the problem with also running a framework and coming after Jacob is that he's stolen my thunder and shown you what a materiality matrix looks like. But I'll just recap it very briefly. So to decide what we report on, we go through this process called materiality. And essentially, it's a 2-stage process. So firstly, we look outwardly and we consult with our stakeholders and our supply chain on what are their thoughts around sustainability and what are their key priorities. We also look at things like other frameworks, standards, regulation that's emerging, and we collect all of those ideas. The second step is to then look inwardly at our industry and ask them what their thoughts are around the key emerging sustainability topics. Ultimately, we bring those together and we end up with this lovely matrix. And you'll see it's very, very similar to the beef one. So trending up towards that top left-hand corner, you see all of our animal wellbeing and animal husbandry topics. Surrounding that, you've got our environmental topics, so things like biodiversity, water security, soil health, pasture management, and greenhouse gas emissions. Coming down to the bottom right-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner, you see some of our topics related to our people and community theme and our economic resilience theme as well. So things like access to labour, occupational health, human health and nutrition. I just want to mention that it's not that these topics are any less important, and we still consider them an important part of our reporting, but we use this matrix to really prioritise our focus because sustainability is a busy space and we can't report on anything. So this is just a matter of prioritisation. Next slide, please, Jacob. So I'm just going to very quickly run through the results from the 2024 Sheep Sustainability Framework annual report and keep going, please. Thank you. So this is how our indicators progressed. So generally we had a really good year and we saw lots of directional improvement. We also had quite a few metrics that were holding steady from the last time they were measured. We do have some areas to work on. And we also had a large proportion of baseline data points, and that is for good reason. We went on a process this year of ensuring alignment between the Sheep Sustainability Framework and the Beef Sustainability Framework, recognising that a lot of the things we report on are very similar and we need to make sure our reporting is aligned for our multi-species producers. So some of the data points that we had when we changed them to be in alignment with the Beef Sustainability Framework, we couldn't report on year equally, so they reverted to baseline data points. Coming into the 2024 report, we also had, coming into the 2024 report, we also had 6 metrics that were missing data, and we managed to fill 4 of those. So we have 2 outstanding. So that's around conservation of land and land transport of sheep. So next slide now, please, Jacob. Thanks. So moving into the highlights, I think the one that's always at the front of everyone's mind is how we went with pain relief adoption. So we consider 3 husbandry procedures, so mulesing, castration and tail docking. And generally we did really, really well. So we saw improvement across almost all of our animal husbandry procedures and practices. The only one that went backwards was tail docking with a hot knife for non-merinos. But we're very pleased that we've seen across the industry an increase in knowledge both on pain relief and also the appropriate pain relief for the relevant husbandry procedure. Next slide, please, Jacob. Some of the other highlights from the 2024 report were that the greenhouse gas emissions for the sheep industry have generally been declining since 2018. So we were down to 8.94 megatons in 2021. So this figure is just on sheep farming and sheep meat processing. We exclude wool processing predominantly because that's done overseas, but we've made strides in reducing our carbon emissions as an industry, and this was measured using GWP 100. The second one there is the Global Life Satisfaction Index, and this is a really exciting one to report on. It's the first time we've included it in the framework, and this was to speak to the physical and mental well-being of our producers. So the index itself encapsulates quite a few things. It's got things in it including standard of living, health, what producers are achieving in life, personal relationships, safety, connectedness to community, and future security. So it's probably one that people might say is a bit subjective, but it is an OECD recognised measurement of well-being. And very positively, sheep graziers came out at 76.1. We actually beat beef graziers, who were 74.3, and the average Australia overall was 69.4. Excuse me for one moment. Sorry, forgive me. Yeah, so sheep graziers were more satisfied with their life than the average Australian, which is really pleasing. And anecdotally, that's because we have exposure to animals and the environment, so generally things that are good for the mental health. But as an industry, we're a very connected group of people and we rely on each other for support. And so that all contributes to our well-being. And then finally there, we had an increase in the gross value of production for sheep meat and greasy wool. So we went up to about $7.6 billion collectively. Next slide, please, Jacob. So it's important for us to be balanced, and we also need to consider some of the challenges that are emerging in industry, and labour availability, which I just noticed has a typo, my bad, is continuing to be a major issue. So roughly about a third of producers are still experiencing challenges with finding both general farm labour as well as shearing labour. Unfortunately, general farm labour became even more challenging this year for some people. Next slide, please, Jacob. Some of the other challenges to consider are workplace health and safety. We found that generally only about half of the producers we surveyed had undertaken a WHS risk assessment of their farm. Even less had a plan to address those risks or were inducting workers in WHS obligations when they came onto their property. So an area that we're continuing to understand and seeing how we can support. We also run a custom calculation, which we call the Federal Award Rate Ratio. So this is a comparison of the shed hand casual hourly rate from the pastoral award and the national minimum wage. And this ratio reduced this year, which is potentially signifying that agriculture is becoming a less attractive industry to workers. And then finally, we had a decrease in the number of sheep that were transacted through NSQA accredited sale yards. Not speaking about NSQA specifically here, but generally we're seeing an emerging trend of a decrease in participation in QA or third-party assurance schemes. That's potentially because they're becoming more expensive and potentially prohibitive to participate in. But we know some of these third-party assurance schemes are important for verifying sustainability claims, so a trend that we're continuing to watch. Next slide, please, Jacob. So very briefly, I just wanted to touch on what's next and what you can expect coming from the sheep sustainability framework. So we're currently developing our second strategic plan, and so that will guide our development over the next 5-year period. We're also doing a review of our data sources and reporting to make sure that we're continuing to use the best information possible. We're doing a bit of a deep dive analysis into how the sheep sustainability framework is meeting our stakeholders' needs in terms of our sustainability reporting, and also looking at our stakeholder engagement strategy to make sure that we're continuing to communicate information as effectively as possible. So these will be all activities that you'll see come to fruition over the next financial year. Next slide, please. Oh, it's stuck. That's it from me. So I will hand over to Dan Forwood.
Thank you very much, Courtney. Once again, thank you to AgForce for having us today. I'm very pleased to be here at your webinar. So my name is Dr Daniel Forwood. I'm a project manager for sheep and goat productivity at MLA. So looking more broadly at on-farm productivity and I'm going to be speaking today a bit about the goat industry sustainability framework. So next slide, please, Jacob. So one of the things I wanted to cover today is why a goat sustainability framework. So goat meat, compared to the other proteins, is almost exclusively exported. So whether this is through our rangeland harvested animals or through commercial farmed goat meat. So over 90% of goat meat is exported overseas, and you'll be interested to know that our top customers are the United States, China, and Japan and South Korea. So they have the market share of our export goat, and this is absolutely key to ensuring that we secure further international markets. And social license is one of the biggest factors that influences our customer base. So particularly looking at the United States, but when we're looking at accessing other markets such as the European Union or the UK, especially for increasing exports of goat meat, social license and social license to operate are becoming increasingly important values that our international counterparts hold. So this is looking not only at environmental sustainability, but broader welfare metrics, financial resilience, etc. So across the entire supply chain as well, we have to be looking at our social license to ensure that we can open our market to more international jurisdictions. So again, just really hammering home the concept of goat meat or Australian goat meat being an international product. It's a very high value export protein. So Australian goat meat represents 44% of the global value or global export value, and that's around $180 million US. Next slide, please, Jacob. So I've given you a bit of context as to more broadly why we would need a sustainability framework internationally. Now, onshore, this sustainability framework piece of work was set as a research development and adoption priority by the Goat Industry Research Development and Adoption Committee. Now I manage this committee at MLA, and this is an MLA funded committee, but comprises 8 representatives, including producers and technical extension specialists. So these producers, we ensure that there are at least 2 Goat Industry Council of Australia representatives. We have 3 rangeland or harvested rangeland goat representatives, and we have 2 commercial farmed goat representatives and a technical extension specialist to ensure that we've got a really good spread across industry. Now, this group comes together quarterly and brings forward our DNA priorities. So they're tasked with speaking to producers, grassroots producers on the ground, and bringing those priorities forward for investment of goat levies in particular. Now, this sustainability framework has come up in conversation in industry and was brought forward as an R&D priority, and that's why MLA is investing in it. So this is also embedded into the Goat Industry Council of Australia's 2023 to 27 strategic plan. So there's several pillars under that strategic plan, and one of the key pillars is sustainability and the formation of a sustainability framework similar to our other red meat counterparts in beef and sheep. So once again, I really want to drive the message home that this is a sustainability framework for industry by industry. Now, as this was brought through our producer research development and adoption priority process, it's really important to us that we ensure that this framework is informed by extensive stakeholder consultation across the supply chain. Next slide, please, Jacob. So the goat industry sustainability framework, similar to the metrics that Courtney and Jacob have been speaking about, will mimic and also utilize data that we're currently collecting in a range of our current R&D investments in the goat industry. So it's building on the Sustainability Credentials project, which will be mapping on-farm emissions and looking at soil carbon and the animals' broader emissions to try and determine on-farm versus controlled emission baselines in goats, because that's largely unknown. And it's covering about 15 different on-farm sites as well as controlled trials to try and assist us with determining what the greenhouse gas emissions data looks like for farmed goats and also rangeland animals. Additionally, we're leveraging this data and also looking at reproductive performance and baselining reproductive performance, especially in the rangeland sector, with our Kids Plus project. So that's quantifying reproductive performance and also kid survival across the board. And these projects are largely being, these projects are largely being run in from central Queensland down to northern New South Wales. Additionally, there's also an animal wellbeing component. So my counterparts in our animal wellbeing research program are looking at developing an on-the-shelf pain relief product commercialized for goats specifically. Now, this currently doesn't exist in Australia, and you have to obtain a script for off-label use from your vet currently. So we're looking at actually having a pain relief product registered on the market for goats. And this is part of a broader piece of work to feed into that sustainability messaging as pain relief comes into the welfare component as well. Now, as Courtney mentioned, the sheep sustainability framework covers two commodities. So that would be sheep meat and wool. In goats, are a little bit more diverse. So we're going to be covering 4 sub-industries within the one sector. So it'll be covering harvested rangeland goats, commercial farmed animals and meat stud, so goat meat, fibre and dairy goat production. So this is going to be a very sector agnostic sustainability framework, looking at covering the entire gamut of the goat industry. Now, as Courtney has mentioned as well, so we're looking at really replicating the sheep sustainability framework because it is a multi-commodity framework, and it's going to be owned by industry. So this will be owned by the Goat Industry Council of Australia, and it's really integral to MLA that we ensure that industry owns this sustainability framework, as industry will be reporting into it. So where we sit currently at the moment is we're in the process of creating a development plan. Now, this development plan is by no means the building of the framework itself, but it's really looking at what is out there. So a bit of a scan of current frameworks. What are the learnings from framework development across the board, and how we can best implement this to ensure that we're capturing the best possible framework metrics for the goat industry. So this is going to include quite extensive stakeholder consultation, and it's going to involve an industry reference group as well to ensure that we're adequately covering the supply chain when we're looking at the goat industry sustainability framework. This development plan will then be presented back to industry, and if it's favourably accepted and the goat industry wants to continue with building the sustainability framework in line with the strategic plan, we'll then undergo a second phase of work to begin the building of the framework itself. And then that will lead into the creation of those metrics and the materiality assessments and everything that Courtney and Jacob have been speaking to today. So it's quite early stage at the moment. This project is going to be running into the first half of next year. So at that point, we'll be able to provide more information. So we've just started the project itself. So that's about it from me. So Jacob, if you jump to the next slide, those are my contact details. But I'll throw back to Annie for the Q&A.
Well, thank you. That was so great that the MLA team could bring us those insights. I might just kick us off with a question, if that's all right, and then take any further questions from the audience. This one's probably Jacob, Courtney, and Daniel. In regards to the matrix approach, it seems very difficult to me to measure the immense importance of food security, given that this is probably one of the most, if not the most fundamental of all social goods. Given no industry is perfect, should all attributes of ESG be treated equally? And do you think we're capturing and weighting this properly in the metrics around ESG performance?
I'm happy to give that a go.
Yeah,
I'll throw to
it's a
Courtney
big one.
and Daniel then. I think that all aspects of ESG are very different, but they're all related as well. We look at how economics lie within the frameworks as their own pillar, but economics is part of every decision that we need to make on farm as well. So the economics essentially sits under every other priority. And so to highlight the importance of food security is a really good point, Annie, and understanding that the importance role that we play in probably our 2 or 3 that food security play into of the UN SDGs as well. We can't understate it. Where it does get difficult is depending on our stakeholders' remit, their own vision, their own priorities, will also determine on where that balance fits as to what is considered important or not, or what is considered more important or more valuable. We do try and weight where possible, and you'll see that's where they kind of ended up on the matrix. But the reason we keep doing them and we keep revisiting these every 3 to 4 years is because we understand those change as well. What's material now won't be material in 2 to 3 times, and 2 to 3 years, sorry, and same looking retrospectively as well. That you may have heard is also there's a lot of talk about carbon tunnel vision. A lot of people are focusing a bit too much on climate and greenhouse gas emissions, while a lot of other things are creeping up, such as forest management and biodiversity. So the benefit of the frameworks is that we do keep that very broad view of all the other priorities that we're looking at the same time that relate to sustainability and ESG. Courtney and Daniel, happy for you to give a better answer as well with that.
I don't know that I can add much more, Jacob. I think you've pretty much nailed it there. But yeah, just to reiterate, we do regularly update our materiality assessments. So we're understanding what the industry prioritization is at the time and what influences there are in terms of ESG reporting and sustainability reporting generally. So Sheep's just gone through the process of updating theirs and are working to implement it currently as well. So we try to stay on topic and relevant to what's happening in the industry at the time.
And I think just Annie, summing that up from a goat perspective, given that we're at the really early stages of the sustainability framework development, there's absolutely scope to look at ESG more broadly and how that best factors into the goat sustainability framework going forward. So once again, we're looking at all of those learnings. So what can be done to help develop a framework that is truly contemporary and using all of the contemporary information that's available, because this is an area that does move quickly and data is always being updated. So where we can, we'll absolutely look at leveraging the updated information where possible.
Yeah, it just sort of seems a shame to me often when people are focusing so much on something like methane to not also balance that with the counterpoint is that agriculture is providing, just about the most essential social service. And I wonder if we just take that for granted. All right, well, I'm just looking at the chat. There hasn't been anything come in. Unless there's anybody who's got any questions, even from within the panel of presenters, we might just draw this to a close. But thank you so much for your time tonight, to all of our excellent speakers. I'm sure that this video will continue to be a really useful resource for our members, and those who have registered no doubt will be requesting it, and I will be encouraging my committee to watch and rewatch it. So thank you so much. All right, so the next webinar will be a lunchtime series. It's on the lunchtime session, sorry. It's on the 19th of September. It might be interesting to you presenters because we're going to be talking with Diogo Costa and Thomas Williams from the Precision Livestock Management Group at CQ University. So no doubt you've heard of their work and would be interested in hearing from them. All right, well, unless there's no further questions there. But thank you to tonight's excellent presenters. I've really enjoyed hearing from you. So